Unobstructed. This is Mark Goldberg with UN Dispatch, speaking with Peter Hakim of the Inter-American Dialogue. Welcome back, Peter.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mark.
So last time we spoke was in July. Events in July. Events had occurred in Honduras, and we spoke about the coup that recently occurred, what gave rise to it. And now here we are, about 5 or 6 months later, and I was hoping that you and I could chat today, and you could sort of maybe update us on the situation. I know that on October 30th there was an announcement that a deal had finally been reached, and now sort of in subsequent days it seems like that deal has fallen apart. So I guess maybe can you, briefly just give us a primer of what happened and what has happened between July and say October 30th.
Well,
and we can get into
to start with,
the rest. Go for it.
The coup d'etat, the ouster of the elected president of Honduras, occurred on June 28th. So when we talked, this was only weeks into the crisis, and the expectation was that with the 32 countries, members of the Organization of American States, all putting enormous pressure on Honduras, and including the United States and Canada, that the situation would be resolved fairly straightforwardly, and that we would probably see, as the countries were asking for, some kind of return of the elected President Zelaya, although with his power constrained and his actions limited. The fact is that the Honduran politics surprised everybody, and it turned out that the de facto president who assumed power was put into power after the removal of President Zelaya, turned out to be far more intransigent and far more tough and far more forceful than anyone had imagined, and simply stood his ground and refused to accept President Zelaya's return. President Zelaya, for his part, tried a variety of different tactics. At times it seemed like he was part of a circus. He tried to cross the border in a remote area, and since he has sneaked into Honduras clandestinely and showed up at the door of the Brazilian embassy, and he's been there for about a month and a half. Fundamentally, at the core of this is the extraordinarily deep mistrust among the two protagonists, the two sides of the Honduran breakdown. And the fact is that neither of them are behaving very appropriately. Neither of them seem ready to make any kind of compromise, and in the end, that's what negotiations are all about. The negotiations are that the two sides start off from their own positions, and then they find ways to make trade-offs, and they reach some kind of middle ground. But that requires a certain amount of good faith, goodwill, interest in seeing an outcome. And as it turns out, I think Honduras has not been served by either the elected President Zelaya, who was removed, or his replacement, Roberto Micheletti. And I think that is one of the core problems. There's been a few other problems, but that's the core. Other problems is that the United States has seen two of its top officials, one Tom...
Right, actually... I know where you're going with this, and I just want to briefly interrupt you to maybe you talked about sort of negotiations that have been ongoing, and the United States, as I think you're about to say, has been playing a key role in these negotiations, and we had on October 30th an announcement of some sort of accord, and it looked like the crisis might have been resolved. But I guess can you explain sort of what was in that accord and sort of why it hasn't been resolved?
Well, for the longest period, there's been attempts by the Organization of American States, have been initiatives led by Costa Rican President Asst to try and bring the two sides together to find a negotiated solution. The importance of the negotiated solution is because there are presidential elections in Honduras, regularly scheduled elections on November 29th. And the idea has long been that they provide a way out of the crisis, that if you can have a fair, free, legitimate election, then the winner of that election becomes the next president of Honduras, and in some sense the crisis, the battle is over. But there was and without an agreement prior to the elections, virtually every country of the hemisphere has said that it would be unwilling to recognize the legitimacy of the elections. So the solution would not be valid without a prior agreement. Well, when things really seem to be unraveling and running off largely out of control, the U.S. did send a very strong negotiating team led by Assistant Secretary State Shannon, and they sat down for 2 days with the various parties, the two presidents, and managed to get their signature on an agreement. The agreement fundamentally suggested that that the election would be recognized as legitimate. Number two is that Zelaya's would come back if the Congress approved his return. The Supreme Court was going to have an advisory opinion that it could issue, but the decision about Zelaya's return would be made by Congress. Those were really...
So things were looking good.
Those looked very good.
Yeah.
The problem turned out, in some ways, there was something of a division, separation between the spirit and the letter of the accord. The spirit of the accord, I think, is clearly that the Congress was going to approve Zelaya's return, again under rather stringent conditions, and that his return would then trigger that the countries of the hemisphere would find the elections legitimate. As it turned out, the agreement itself simply says that Congress will decide, and it didn't say that they would decide necessarily in President Zelaya's favor. And so that uncertainty, coupled with one more, there was a call for the establishment of a government of national unity. And again, the two protagonists were supposed to sort of work that through. Well, since Zelaya was not assured that he would be allowed to return, he has been refusing to participate in the process of setting up this government of national unity. And instead of continuing negotiating, Micheletti took it on himself to poll a range of institutions and try to get their input, and he was going to create a government of national unity with himself at the head. Well,
that doesn't sound very unified.
Well, it's not. It's a government of unity that doesn't unify anything. And the fact is, I think both of them ended up sort of again violating the spirit of the accord. Any accord, there's always loopholes in. There's always ways of getting around the what's written down. So it does require, again, a willingness to compromise, certain good faith on both sides, and neither President Zelaya nor de facto President Nicoletti have shown the necessary, even minimal goodwill necessary to move this forward.
So let's talk about the American sort of role in all this.
Okay.
As you know, the United States is sort of the single most important country to Honduras in terms of, sort of economic trade. At first, the United States took a very hard line against the coup, but I'll leave it to you to explain, what sort of the State Department, what the Obama administration more broadly has been up to in trying to resolve this controversy, and maybe throw it to you to sort of add your judgments as to how you think they handled it more broadly.
Well, let me say, I think that the U.S. At the outset really wanted to have this resolved multilaterally. This would basically help strengthen the inter-American institutions. It would make clear that the U.S. was not trying to impose its will, but that was willing to work with the other countries of the hemisphere. And I think that the hard position that the U.S. took with the other countries was a result of that interest in being part of the consensus. The fact is, I don't think the U.S. was ever fully comfortable with that tougher line. I think that it very much felt more comfortable with developments in Honduras once, in fact, the Oscar Arias and the OAS began openly to negotiate with the two parties rather than simply using ultimatums and sanctions to move things along. And so I think right from the beginning there was a certain, like I say, discomfort, which communicated itself as a certain ambiguity about U.S. policy. And that was not particularly helpful. But also wasn't terribly helpful was that because of the partisan debates over Honduras in Washington, Tom Shannon, who was supposed to go to Brazil as the ambassador, and Arturo Valenzuela, who was intended to replace Shannon as assistant secretary, their appointments were put on hold by a Republican senator, which meant that they could not occupy the position. And what happened was, again, a certain ambiguity or ambivalence about the amount of direct action the U.S. should take, and it began to seem as if the U.S. really was not as strongly engaged as it should have been. What the U.S. has to find in trying to manage these kinds of multilateral initiatives, which Obama is clearly committed to, is a balance between having the U.S. involved, having the U.S. present, at the same time avoiding the sense that the U.S. is imposing itself. I think at times the U.S. seemed to withdraw rather than sort of being an active, present partner. And when you're dealing with a country like Honduras, country with enormous ties to the U.S., where the U.S. has enormous influence, I think that it was very important that the U.S. stay closer to this, because when the U.S. was close, in fact, some positive advances were made. It was the U.S. involvement that brought Oscar Arias into the negotiations and moved the process toward a real negotiating effort. It was finally the U.S., the leadership of U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere, that sort of reached the tentative agreement on October 30th that unfortunately has unraveled by now, or is certainly rapidly unraveling. But it does seem to me the U.S. managed this in a less than ideal way.
I've read analysis that suggests that that the senator that put the hold on these on the ambassador to Brazil, who was formerly the Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemispheric Affairs, Tom Shannon, was Senator Jim DeMint of South Carolina. And I'd heard, as I said, I'd seen analysis suggesting that one of the big sort of something that helped dissolve this tentative agreement reached on October 30th was the United States backing away from its commitment to recognize the elections only if Zelaya could be interim president before the elections, and that Shannon, who was up to be ambassador to Brazil, seemed to walk back that commitment, and that sort of helped to. He walked back that commitment in part to satisfy Jim DeMint, so he would lift his hold on Shannon's nomination to be ambassador to Brazil. Is that does that seem to make sense to you?
I think that's far too conspiratorial and instrumental, okay. And Tom Shannon would never be that self-serving. I know him well. Right. That's really outrageous. Let me say that a couple of points are important here. There is a real question of whether what was needed to get the elections considered legitimate was that the agreement reached on October 30th. This was an agreement between Micheletti, the de facto president, and elected President Zelaya. They both put their signatures. If in fact that agreement reasonably held, the assumption was that the elections would be considered legitimate. Now, this is where the disagreement comes in. The U.S. suggested that the agreement called for Congress to decide whether, in fact, Zelaya could return. And once Congress spoke, and the other parts of the agreement were implemented, that you could have a legitimate election without Zelaya returning. Zelaya's supporters suggest no, the real spirit of the agreement was that there was an arrangement prior with Congress and that Zelaya would return. That's the real spirit. So there was a disagreement. Tom Shannon, perhaps prematurely, suggested that the U.S. was prepared to recognize the election even if Zelaya didn't come back. And he didn't make it crystal clear enough that, in fact, he didn't say if the agreement is followed closely by the two protagonists. And I think that the measure of whether the election should be considered legitimate has to do with the implementation of the agreement, not Zelaya's return. That's my own view. There's differences on that view, obviously.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you can sort of talk to if there any other sort of regional implications of events in Honduras in the last 6 months or so. If how have Honduras's neighbors viewed what happened, and could there be could there be any sort of long-lasting sort of regional consequences for what happened, and sort of what might what might it tell about the future of Latin America more broadly?
Well, I think one thing we should I'd like to, in my own view, is pretty clear that a lot of the sort of tough line against Honduras is being justified so that there's never a coup again in Latin America. That this notion that government can be toppled by the military has to finally be eliminated from Latin America. My own sense is that Honduras is not going to be a model for other coup d'etats. There have been very few forced removals of presidents in Latin America over the past 20 years. Have been a few. Interestingly, most of the other countries that are calling for a tough line toward Honduras really did nothing when the president of Ecuador, for example, in 1997 was basically pushed out of power with the assistance of the military. When street mobs forced the resignation of several presidents in Bolivia. So there is a little bit of hypocrisy with regard to Honduras. But the point is, I don't think that we're going to see many more coups in Latin America. I think that era is ended, and if they do occur, what happened in Honduras is not going to be the example to follow. In fact, everyone can see that the Hondurans have already paid a huge price in terms of their economy and in terms of their pariah status that they're now in.
I guess it seems that... sorry, go ahead.
That does not mean that this will not have significance beyond the border, but it's not in terms of justifying or not justifying coup d'etats.
And I mean, you see, this it seems coup was, supporters of the coup justify it by saying that, Zelaya was going for an illegal power grab anyway, and that he was going to, maybe try to extend his term beyond what was constitutionally mandated. And, how do you sort of stop that from happening? How do you, without sort of using the military to depose the sitting president? What options, what could have averted this crisis, and could that help us in the future?
Well, first let me say that there is a certain sense that the extremes have taken over this debate. That anybody who suggests that somehow Zelaya was legitimately, legally removed, constitutionally removed from power is really not looking at the facts. That's a very extreme position when the military come calling in 4 o'clock in the morning and take somebody out of the presidential palace and put them on a plane and ship them out of the country. To call that in any sense a legal transition is bordering on the absurd. On the other side, the sort of demand that the coming elections not be considered legitimate unless Zelaya is returned to power simply avoids recognizing how damaging a presidential period Zelaya oversaw, how irresponsible a person he really was, and how much he provoked. He did all he could, almost, it seemed, to provoke some kind of forced removal. And secondly, the hypocrisy of putting all this punishment sanctions on small, impoverished Honduras when countries were not willing to do this. In the case of Fujimori in Peru, did not do anything to respond to the ouster of Jamal Moad in Ecuador. I think that, like I say, I think that extreme positions have seemed to dominate, and that was one of the reasons to applaud the Shannon negotiated agreement that brought the two sides together finally in somewhat of an act of moderation, which obviously didn't work out. But my own view very strongly is that this was a coup d'etat, clearly was a violation, and let me add that there's going to be presidents that are pushed out of office in ways that are not fully constitutional, it would be excellent if the hemisphere, which is dominated by democracies, could actually find a mechanism and a means to defend democracy whenever it comes under threat. But frankly, the hemisphere is so divided now. There's so many differences in what democracy is, what it claims to be, between Venezuela on one hand, Brazil, Mexico, Bolivia. All of them have different interpretations. They're all playing out a rather conflictive, divisive period in hemispheric relations. And as such, it's very difficult for the hemisphere to act in unison, which is critical if these democratic violations are going to be addressed. And let me add one other thing, that many of the countries are in their own ways violating their own constitutions. Venezuela is perhaps the poster child for this, in that we've seen the central government censor newspapers, arrest opponents, prevent local officials who disagreed with the central government from taking office, seen an enormous concentration of political power in the hands of one man. These are all sort of violations of basic democratic principles, and there's very little reaction from most of Latin America.
Well, with that very, I think, moderate and sound approach to this, I thank you very much, Peter, for speaking to me again.
Good questions. Thank you very much. I enjoyed this very much. Thank you.
Thanks, and keep us posted, please.
Okay, will do.